The moment I walked through those heavy oak doors, the courtroom fell silent. I was in my full U.S. Air Force JAG Corps Class A service dress uniform. The fabric was stiff, the middles polished. I spotted my family in the third row. I saw my father, Robert, a retired sales executive who had always seen my career as a failure, lean over to my mother. He let out a quiet, wheezing laugh. I knew exactly what he was saying. "She actually wore her little costume," he whispered. My mother, Helen, a woman who only wanted a quiet life, sighed and shook her head, the familiar look of embarrassment on her face, as if I were a 5-year-old playing dress-up at a funeral. I ignored them, my footsteps echoing on the marble, and took my seat behind the prosecution table. The presiding federal judge, Judge Wallace, entered. He was all business, adjusting his robes as he sat. "Case 924-CR000081, he began, his voice booming. "The United States versus David Jensen." He looked up, scanning the tables, and his eyes landed on me. He froze. I mean, he completely stopped mid-sentence. The air in the room turned to ice. He fumbled for his glasses, pushing them up his nose, his voice suddenly dropping to a strange whisper that broke the silence. "Dear God," he said, "Captain Jensen? The Captain Jensen? Operation Nightshade." I saw the 2 U.S. Marshals flanking his bench. They didn't just straighten up, they snapped to a parade rest posture. The tension in that courtroom was a universe away from the scene just 2 weeks earlier. We were at the obligatory Sunday dinner, which was really just a weekly coronation for my brother, David. David, the family's golden boy, is a flashy tech entrepreneur who wears his charisma like a shield. He was holding court as usual, brushing off his recent complications. "It's just a bureaucratic mix-up, Dad," he said, waving his fork. He had just been indicted for wire fraud and, far more seriously, for violating the Arms Export Control Act. But the way he told it, it sounded like a parking ticket. My father, Robert, a man obsessed with David's so-called visionary status, ate it up. He's the one who always called my government job my safe little hobby. "That's my boy," Robert said, beaming. "His high-priced lawyers will swat this away. They said the prosecutor is just some low-level JAG clerk, probably a diversity hire trying to make a name for herself." David laughed, then turned that $1,000,000 smile on me. "Hey, legal eagle," he said, using the nickname that always felt like a pat on the head. "You work in that world. Maybe you can go down to the courthouse and, I don't know, file some papers for my team, get them coffee." My father and mother both laughed. It was a hearty, genuine laugh, as if David had just told the funniest joke in the world. I sat there, my face a mask of what I hoped was polite indifference. Inside, though, a cold, professional fury was building. I didn't just see the new car or the startup funding they had given him. I saw every time I had to work a second job in law school while he got a new condo. I saw every "we're so proud" for his failures and every dismissive "oh, that's nice, dear" for my successes. They were laughing, and they had absolutely no idea. I knew exactly who that low-level JAG clerk was. He was laughing, asking the lead prosecutor on his multi-million-dollar federal case to fetch coffee. He had no idea he had just confessed to me. Do you understand the silence that shattered that courtroom? You have to understand the 2 lives I was living. My father, Robert, had a term for David's catastrophic business failures. He called it aggressive risk-taking. I remember the summer David lost $50,000 of their retirement money on a crypto scam. My father slapped him on the back at a boat party, loud and proud. "That's how you learn, son," he boomed over the music. "You've got to break a few eggs." Meanwhile, I had to fight for a month just to get them to co-sign my original student loan. The hypocrisy was so thick I could barely breathe around it. My mother, Helen, was just as bad, only quieter. Her worship was domestic. When David got a tiny 2-paragraph mention in TechCrunch for an app that never even launched, she had it professionally framed. It hung in the hallway like a Nobel Prize. I sighed every time I came home, a constant reminder of the metric I could never meet. It was a monument to potential, while my actual, tangible achievements simply evaporated. I remember the day my bar exam results came in. I had worked 3 years for that moment and passed on the first try. I called home, my voice shaking just a little. Mom, Dad, I passed. I'm officially an attorney. There was a pause. Then my mother's voice, distracted. Oh, that's nice, dear. That's wonderful. Listen, can I call you back? David needs our help picking out the interior for his new Tesla, and your father can't decide between the black or the white. That was my life. The Tesla interior was a two-person family crisis. Me becoming a lawyer was nice. I wasn't just the invisible child, I was the boring, practical, background noise child. In their eyes, I was a lifer, a pencil pusher. David was the visionary, the one too bold for the real world. I was the one who was too timid for it. My uniform, the one I had bled for, they called it my costume, a safe little admin job for the girl who wasn't smart enough or brave enough to be like her brother. But the person they saw, that quiet, agreeable, safe daughter, was a fiction. She was a character I played at Sunday dinners because it was easier than fighting. The real me lived in a world they couldn't even imagine. My office wasn't some beige cubicle farm. It was a sensitive, compartmented information facility, a SCIF, buried deep inside Andrews Air Force Base. A silent, sterile, windowless room where your phone is locked in a box at the door and the only sound is the hum of industrial air scrubbers. While they were debating Tesla interiors, I was standing at the head of a mahogany table, briefing a panel of one-star generals, senior DOJ officials, and my own commanding officer, my CO, Colonel Hayes, a grizzled, fair man who didn't care about charisma. He cared about results, and he saw me as his sharpest legal asset. He nodded for me to begin, and I clicked to the first slide. My voice was low, precise, and cold. Good morning, sir. The subject, I said, my brother, David Jensen, has violated the Arms Export Control Act by routing controlled LAR technology through a shell corporation in Dubai. The room was dead silent. We have the wire transfers, the SWIFT identifiers, and the full server logs from the Nightshade warrant. He wasn't just selling unapproved tech, he's compromised an entire strategic defense platform. I let that hang in the air. I wasn't Laura, I wasn't Legal Eagle. In that room, I was Captain Jensen, the lead investigator and soon-to-be lead prosecutor on a case that touched national security. I watched the faces of the men at the table, men who managed billion-dollar budgets and entire fleets, go hard. Colonel Hayes broke the silence, his voice like gravel. This isn't just fraud, Captain. What your brother did is bordering on treason. The Attorney General's office wants this fast-tracked. They want an example made. And I just thought, treason? My family was worried about coffee. The sheer gaping chasm between their narrative and my reality was staggering. They thought I was a joke, but in my world, I was the one who held the rule book. For years, I had tried to speak their language of emotion and ego, but they only understood status and power. The problem was, I had a status they couldn't even comprehend. So I decided it was time to finally speak to them in the only language they respected: consequences. The first thing I had to do professionally was walk away. You can't prosecute your own family. It's the most basic ethical line in the book, a line my brother had clearly never learned. I walked into Colonel Hayes' office, my back rigid, and formally recused myself from the prosecution of United States versus Jensen. He just nodded, his face grim. I expected this, Captain. It's the right move. I felt a strange, hollow emptiness as I left his office. After all that work, I was benched. I was back on the sidelines just like I always was. Or so I thought. David's new legal team, on the other hand, had no such ethics. They were expensive, loud, and dripping with an arrogance that only comes from never having lost a case in civilian court. A week later, a new filing hit the JAG office desk. It was a motion to dismiss. I started reading the first page and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Their entire argument, their entire legal strategy rested on discrediting the initial investigation. They claimed all the key evidence, the nightshade warrants, all of it, was fruit of the poisoned tree. They argued it was all handled by an unqualified, overzealous junior officer with a clear personal vendetta. An unqualified junior officer? That was me. They were painting me as the hysterical little sister, the hobby cop my father always saw, the legal eagle who should be fetching coffee. I was staring at the motion when my desk phone rang. It was Colonel Hayes. "Captain," he said, his voice flat, no emotion. "I've read their motion. So has Judge Wallace." He paused, and I could hear him breathing. "Your recusal is from prosecution. It is not, however, a recusal from testifying to your own work." I held my breath, my knuckles white around the receiver. "Their entire case rests on discrediting you personally," he continued. "The judge isn't just dismissing their motion. He wants the originating investigator to testify on the warrant's affidavit. That's you." The trap wasn't one I set. It was one they built for themselves, and I was just the one to spring it. This was the only way. I wouldn't be an attorney at that table. I would be a material witness for the prosecution, called to speak to the facts of my own investigation. My mother called that night, her voice full of that fake, brittle cheer. "We're all coming to the courthouse tomorrow, honey, to support David. My father and I will be in the gallery." "That's nice, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I'll see you there." That night, I didn't prepare a prosecution. I sat at my desk and methodically reviewed my own 200-page affidavit, highlighting the statutes, the timelines, and the specific legal codes I had used to build the case. My brother's lawyers had built their entire defense on the idea that I was a nobody. They had no idea they had just personally invited that nobody to sit in the witness box and read her resume into the official court record. We were back in the courtroom. I sat at the prosecution table, spine straight, eyes forward. I could feel them in the gallery behind me, that familiar heavy weight. I could feel my father's smug certainty, my mother's exhausted pity, my brother's unearned confidence. David's lawyer, a man in a $10,000 suit, stood with practiced, polished confidence. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice smooth, "we move to dismiss all charges." He gestured vaguely toward the prosecution. "Their entire case is frankly fruit of a poisoned tree, based on the amateur and vindictive investigation of a Captain Laura Jensen." He said my name with such a flourish of dismissal it was almost comical. From the gallery, I heard it, that quiet, wheezing laugh from my father. I heard my mother's tired sigh, the one that always meant, "Oh, Laura, why are you making things difficult?" But Judge Wallace wasn't looking at the lawyer. He was staring, frozen, at me. His hand, which had been reaching for a glass of water, stopped midair. He fumbled for his glasses, his voice, when it came, cracking through the silence. "Dear God! Captain Jensen! The Captain Jensen! Operation Nightshade?" The two U.S. Marshals flanking the bench, who had been standing at ease, snapped their shoulders back, their bodies rigid, hands clasped. The shift was electric. My father's laugh died in his throat, my mother's sigh hitched. Their smirks evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp, confused silence. Judge Wallace leaned forward, his eyes narrowing into slits as he stared down David's lawyer. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble that filled the entire room. "Counselor, are you serious?" The lawyer's polished smile faltered. "You are standing in my federal courtroom and you are claiming incompetence?" He said the word like it was poison, from the officer who had received the Attorney General's Award for Excellence in National Security for her investigation into the Red Dagger arms ring. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel the blood drain from my brother's face. I could feel the sudden, panicked intake of breath from the gallery where my father, Robert, sat, the man who had called my career a safe little hobby. My mother, Helen, who worried about Tesla interiors. I could picture her clutching her pearls, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with David's legal trouble and everything to do with the stranger sitting at the prosecution table. The judge wasn't done. He held up a thick, bound document, my affidavit. I have read Captain Jensen's affidavit. It is the most ironclad, surgically precise piece of investigative law I have seen in my decade on this bench. He slammed it down, the sound echoing like a gavel. Operation Nightshade. Dear God, man, we teach this case at the War College. We teach it as the definitive legal framework for prosecuting digital arms trafficking, and you are citing her work as incompetent? The silence that followed was absolute. Then Judge Wallace turned his gaze to me. His expression softened for just a second with a look of profound respect, a look I had spent 30 years trying to earn from my own family and never received. Captain Jensen, he said, his voice now formal, are you prepared to be sworn in to testify on the specifics of this warrant? I stood. My uniform, the costume, suddenly felt like armor. Yes, Your Honor. I began the walk. I stepped past the bar. I walked past my brother's table. He looked small, hollow, a ghost in an expensive suit. I walked past the gallery, and in my periphery I saw my father. He was pale, trembling, his eyes locked on the rank on my shoulder. He involuntarily started to rise from his seat, his body snapping into a posture of military respect he hadn't shown in 20 years, before he caught himself and slumped back down. David's lawyer was stammering, his confidence shattered. Your Honor, we withdraw our motion. Judge Wallace's face was granite. Motion to withdraw is denied. I want to hear the captain speak. Swear her in. My father had spent my entire life teaching me that I was a footnote. In the end, it only took 2 words from a federal judge, Operation Nightshade, for him to finally understand that I was the one writing the history. I took the oath. My hand was steady on the Bible. For the next hour, I didn't just testify, I lectured. I walked the court through every timestamp, every server log, every single encrypted transfer. I explained the technical specifics of the LAR technology and the exact statute of the Arms Export Control Act it violated. I deconstructed my own 200-page affidavit line by line. There was no emotion in my voice, only fact. The unqualified junior officer was teaching a masterclass in federal prosecution and national security law. David's expensive lawyer didn't ask a single question on cross-examination. He just sat down, his face ashen. When I was finished, Judge Wallace looked at my brother. His voice was pure ice. Mr. Jensen, your counsel's motion to dismiss is not just denied, it is eviscerated. Based on the testimony of Captain Jensen, this court finds that the threat your actions pose is staggering. He wasn't just a fraudster anymore. He was a national security risk. The judge continued, given the international contacts and the clear, willful disregard for the law, this court finds you are a significant flight risk and a clear danger to this nation's security. He banged the gavel. Bail is denied. The defendant is remanded into the custody of the U.S. Marshals. 2 marshals moved in immediately. They had David stand and put his hand behind his back. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It echoed in the silence, a final metallic snap. My brother, the golden boy, the visionary, the one who was too good for the rules, just looked small. He was crying, but silently. From the gallery, I heard a sound, a terrible, strangled gasp. It was my mother, Helen, folding in on herself. My father, Robert, just stared, his face a mask of gray, abject shock. They were utterly broken. Their entire world, their entire belief system, shattered in the space of an hour. They were alone. I stepped down from the witness box, gathered my files, and walked back to the prosecution table. The DOJ team, the ones who had replaced me as lead prosecutor, all stood as I approached. One of them, a senior counsel I'd only met twice, reached out and shook my hand firmly. "That was biblical, Captain," he whispered. My commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, was waiting by the door. He didn't smile. He didn't hug me. He just looked me in the eye, his gaze level and filled with the respect I had spent my life craving from my father. He gave me one single, sharp nod. "Well done, Captain," he said. That one nod was worth more than a lifetime of my family's hollow praise. That was the end of one life and the beginning of another. 1 year later, I walked into my new office. The plaque on the door was heavy brass. It didn't say Captain. It read Major Laura Jensen. I was no longer just an investigator. I was leading my own division, specializing in the exact kind of complex, high-stakes international cases my brother's actions had exposed. My safe little hobby had become one of the sharpest points of the entire JAG Corps. Later that day, I was briefing a new class of recruits, 30 sharp, focused faces looking back at me in a state-of-the-art command center. I was teaching them, ironically, the legal precedent established by Operation Nightshade. As I spoke, I realized I was no longer the invisible child. I wasn't legal. I wasn't a footnote in that room. I was the authority. These people, this team, this new generation of lawyers hanging on my every word, this was my family. It wasn't a family built on obligation or dysfunctional roles. It was a family built on merit, mutual respect, and competence. The old family were just ghosts now. David never took the case to trial. Faced with my testimony, his high-priced lawyers had him accept a plea deal. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for violating the Arms Export Control Act. The wire fraud charges were just a footnote. My parents, Robert and Helen, had to sell their house, the house I grew up in, the one where David's TechCrunch article once hung on the wall, to pay for his initial legal fees and the first tranche of federal restitution. They lived in a small condo now, somewhere out of state. I was drafting new legislation one afternoon when an email popped up. It was from an address I didn't recognize, but the name was Robert Jensen. The subject line simply read, Major. I clicked it. The message was short, just a few lines. "Laura," it began, we didn't know. We saw you on C-SPAN. You were testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Your mother and I, we are so proud. We were so wrong." I read the words proud and wrong. They were the words I had waited my entire life to hear, the words I had ached for, the validation I had chased. And as I sat there in my new office, looking at the plaque on my desk, I felt nothing. Not anger, not forgiveness, not even satisfaction, just quiet. The validation had come, but it was years too late. I had already validated myself. His apology, his pride, it was for him, not for me. My peace was no longer dependent on their approval. I took a slow sip of my coffee, clicked the archive button, and the email vanished. I turned back to my work. My family thought a legacy was something you inherited at a loud dinner party. I learned that a true legacy is something you build in silence and have read into the permanent record of a federal court. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story below. In this community, your expertise is always recognized.